I want to hold your hand. German version. Take one.
Even though the Beatles were a British, English-speaking band, they were certainly a global phenomenon. So many of their releases in non-English-speaking countries would have sleeves with translated song titles. For instance, here's the Mexican 45 sleeve for All You Need Is Love, or Todo Lo Que Necesitas Es Amor. But when Mexican fans would play this 45, of course, they would hear the Beatles singing the song in English.
All you need is love.
But for 2 songs only, some non-English fans would get a surprise. 2 songs in their native language. Komm, deine, Hand and liebt, dich, better known as the German versions of I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You. This is a story of how those songs came to be. The Beatles were no stranger to Germany. While the Cavern in Liverpool is the most famous of the band's iconic early venues, they developed their stage presence and gained their live chops in Hamburg, in clubs like the Kaiser Keller, the Top 10, and the Star Club. These weren't one-off gigs, they were residencies.
Well, you say you're going away. That leads us on to another question now. Where are you going?
Germany, Hamburg.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, you have
2 weeks.
standing in great engagements over there, haven't you?
Well, the boys have been there quite a lot, you know, and I've been there with other groups, but this is the first time I've been there with the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
This residency at the Star Club would be the group's last in Germany. Perhaps it was this link to Hamburg and German culture that propelled EMI's West German subsidiary to ask the Beatles management to cater to this audience with German language recordings. Elektrola Gesellschaft, the subsidiary, wanted to release these tracks on their Odeon label. Beatles producer George Martin said they were adamant about not being able to sell the group's songs at Beatlemania levels unless they were sung in German. And indeed, if we look at the top-selling singles in Germany at this time, all of them were in that country's primary language. Martin eventually agreed to attempt 2 songs, but the band took some convincing. Martin said, "The Beatles didn't agree, but I persuaded them." But actually getting them into the studio was another story. More on that in a moment. As for the songs themselves, 2 of the band's biggest hits were chosen. I Want to Hold Your Hand, which sold millions of copies worldwide within weeks of its release, and She Loves You, the Beatles' all-time best-selling song in the UK, with a total of nearly 2 million copies sold there alone. Now comes the fun part, how to put them into German. Enter Camillo Jean-Nicolas Felgen. Felgen, from Luxembourg, was a big enough name in entertainment in his own right.
The thing is that Camillo Felgen, who sings this, is himself a disc jockey on the German section of Radio Luxembourg, and he and his colleagues play his 35 records that he's made 40 times a week. So we welcome Camillo Felgen.
So lang weißt du warst, so lang du mir noch warst.
He was brought to the project because not only did the songs need to be in German, they needed to make sense in that language while still working with the melody, rhythm, and overall feel of the music. A direct translation wouldn't do. Some of the lyrics, like Sie liebt dich, are easy enough. She loves you. But let's look at this verse in English.
She said you heard her so, she almost lost her mind, but now she says she knows you're not the hurting kind. She said she loves you.
The companion verse in German goes like this.
Du hast dir wehgetan, sie wusste nicht warum, du warst nicht schuld daran und redest dich nicht oh ja, die liebt dich.
Hyde Flippo of The German Way translates these lyrics back into English. You have hurt her. She didn't know why. It wasn't your fault, and you didn't turn around. When looking at each song's lyrics as a whole, the meanings are preserved, although it's not exactly what Paul and John wrote. Apparently, though, these discrepancies didn't matter much because, spoiler alert, these German language tracks as one single reached the top 10 in Germany. It should be noted that Felgen originally received co-writing credits for these tracks, but they came as his pen name, Jean-Nicolas. There are 2 other names credited on this single. Heinz Helmer on one side and Lee Montague on the other. And there's a big question here. Who were they? Did they actually aid in the translation? Mark Lewison doesn't mention these names in Chronicle or recording sessions, and Bruce Spicer says they're pen names for Felgen. However, Wikipedia cites a 2004 private email exchange with Felgen with some backstory. That John Lennon rejected the translation attempts of translators Helmer and Montague, and Felgen was called in at the last minute. It does appear that Lee Montague was a name used in pop songwriting, as shown here in a book of copyrights from 1968. This looks like an alias for a European music exec, Lawrence Yaskiel, who was active starting in the 1950s. There's a decent bio on Discogs about him, but I couldn't find anything to confirm his links to the Beatles. Digging deeper is beyond the scope of this video, so if you're privy to more info, please let me know. It should be noted that reissues of the songs generally only list Lennon and McCartney as songwriters. Regardless, Felgen was involved, and his job wasn't complete with his work on the translations. He'd helped the Beatles record the songs. January 1964. Most fans know this era was intense for the band. In fact, they'd quote-unquote invade America and appear on The Ed Sullivan Show 3 times the very next month. But for now, they were in Paris for a string of concerts starting January 16th. This was practically another residency, like those in Hamburg a few years earlier. This would entail 18 days of 2 to 3 shows each day at the Olympia Theater. Although the Beatles were abroad and busy with performances, George Martin booked studio time in Paris for January 29th at EMI's Pathé Marconi Studios. The morning of, translator Felgen, George Martin, and engineer Norman Smith were ready to get the job done, but the Beatles weren't. When George Martin called the hotel to check on them after an hour of waiting, roadie Neil Aspinall told Martin they're in bed. They've decided not to go to the studio. Martin was furious, saying later, "I went crazy. It was the first time they had refused to do anything for me." Martin and Felgen hopped in a taxi to meet the band personally. George Martin burst into their suite to find Paul's girlfriend, Jane Asher, making tea for John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And as George Martin put it, it looked like it was right out of the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. After some convincing by Martin and sheepish apologies from the Beatles, they all headed directly to the studio to conduct the only Beatles recording session outside of England. Sidebar, because Beatle fans are notorious detail snobs, present company included, I should point out that there was another outside the UK session for Beatles music. The Inner Lights backing track, recorded on January 12, 1968 in Bombay. Is this a Beatles session? I'll let you guys hash it out in the comments. Considering Felgen's presence, the first order of business at the studio was likely some dialogue and accent coaching for the band, going through Felgen's lyrics to the group's music. Of course, the Beatles were familiar with the German language, so they weren't starting from scratch. With the tape machines rolling, the next task was new vocals for the German twin of I Want to Hold Your Hand. A few days prior, back at Abbey Road, Norman Smith had made a copy of the instrumental track of the song and brought it with him to Paris, making the process much easier.
Take 2.
Oh yeah, come out.
What the fuck? Okay, this is edit piece, take 10.
Komm, gib mir deine Hand.
And after 11 takes of the Beatles singing and sometimes clapping their hands, Komm, gib mir deine Hand was finished. But Sie liebt dich / She Loves You was a different story. Instead of simply adding new vocals to the pre-existing track, the band re-recorded Sie liebt dich completely. Why? Unfortunately, the 2-track master tape couldn't be found. Whether misplaced, stolen, or perhaps worst of all, recorded over, it was lost to history. At least Ringo would have something to add besides hand claps. After 13 takes, the instrumental track was completed and new German vocals were added. If you listen to this one closely, you'll hear that it doesn't sound exactly like She Loves You. For one, the tempo seems a bit faster, but the instrumentation is also different. Lennon played his Rickenbacker electric instead of the Gibson J160E acoustic heard on the English She Loves You. To say this was a productive session is an understatement. The Beatles were efficient in the studio in this era, but George Martin must have lit a fire under them in Paris. During this one-day session in a foreign studio, they'd not only wrap up the 2 German tracks, but also record most of Paul's new song, Can't Buy Me Love. So much was accomplished that a second scheduled session at Pathé Marconi 2 days later was canceled. If you want to hear more from this Paris session, take 2 of Can't Buy Me Love with backing vocals from George and John is included on Anthology 1. The 2 new German tracks were on store shelves in Germany soon after they were recorded. There's a mysterious timetable here, though, and I'm posting an extra video segment about this exclusively for my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to check it out, please consider signing up. A huge thanks to those who already have. But back to the single. As I mentioned earlier, it sold well in Germany, hitting the top 10. As for other countries, you may not think German-language tracks would see a wide release, but the single appeared in Australia, and the 2 tracks came out separately in America. Note another Beatles milestone with the US release of So liebt dich. Reaching number 96 on the charts, the group became the first artist to score multiple top 100 hits in 2 different languages. Of course, I can't play these 2 tracks in this video due to copyright, but if you want to hear them, check out the Past Masters collection first released in 1988. I've linked to it down in the description. 1964 was a very good year for the Beatles. The band's rise to fame was felt across the globe, including in Germany. Their original recordings, in English, started to top the charts there, not quite what EMI's German wing expected. George Martin later admitted, "The Beatles were right, actually. It wasn't necessary for them to record in German, but they weren't graceless. They did a good job." The Beatles wouldn't record for a foreign language audience again.
Hello, it's Lance. If you're new here, I've got plenty more here on the FabFourArchivist channel, so please check it out and please subscribe. And longtime fans may notice that I've used a clip of the Beatles playing on a different German language song before. If that doesn't ring a bell, you should watch or rewatch my video about Bernard Purdie and the Beatles and pay attention around the 7-minute mark.